Book of Daniel. We're going to start a new study tonight. We finished up in Hebrews, and we want to talk about Daniel. There's just two passages in Daniel that I really want to look at, and these passages are in both Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7. All right, and just to give you a little preview, what's happening here is in Daniel chapter 2, there is a vision by Nebuchadnezzar that Daniel interprets, and we'll be discussing that vision. And then we find out in Daniel chapter 7 that there is a vision that Daniel has, and that vision just parallels the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had. But it gives us a little more detail as to what takes place. Let me give you a little history of Daniel. Tonight, basically what we'll do is we'll get all of the foundation of this settled in, so that as we get into it next week, we'll get more into what's taking place. Daniel was a part of Judah. When God allowed Babylon to overtake Judah, Daniel was taken in what we would call the first siege. Now keep in mind, the northern kingdom of Israel has already been taken captive because they were out of the will of God, and he allowed them to be taken captive. And now Babylon is the ruling nation in the area of the Middle East, if you would. And in being that, they have now come to a place and a time where they're going to overtake Judah. And so God has ordained this because of their mischief, because of their sin. And so what's happening here is God's going to put them in captivity for 70 years. We talked about that actually back in, I think maybe in Hebrews or before, I can't remember. But regardless, what happens here is they take the people captive, but they do it in 3 stages. The first stage is they come in and they essentially take all of the young men or young ladies, all the people that they feel like are the highest quality of people, so that they can bring them back to Babylon and use them for their service. They would take the young men, for example, and train them up and teach them in their schools, and so they could learn the Babylonian way, and they could be a help to them in regard to being servants or for whatever else needs to be done. And so on this first siege is when Daniel was taken. There's, by the way, 2 more sieges. They come again, and they basically kind of do the same thing. And then they come and they completely and totally destroy Jerusalem. They destroy the temple. They beat it all down, tear it up. That's why guys like Zerubbabel later have to come back and rebuild the temple. Nehemiah comes back and rebuilds the walls. It's because of this attack by Babylon. And so they destroy all of Jerusalem. And so what we find is Daniel has been taken captive. Daniel 1:4 says, children in whom was no blemish, these are the ones they took, children in whom was no blemish, but well-favored, skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So here we have a situation where they came and took all these young people captive for the purpose of them serving Babylon. All right? So a lot of them, when they came into Babylon, a lot of them were still very young. Daniel is estimated to be about 15 years old or so at this time. But when they bring them all into Babylon, what happens is they bring them in, teach them the tongue of the Chaldeans, teach them the ways of the Babylons and the Babylonians, and what they believe, what they teach, obviously incorporate their pagan worship. And Daniel and some of his friends, even though they were faithful to go ahead and be good servants and do all the things that was asked of them, until it came to the place where they had to worship the pagan gods. And this is where they drew their line, because they were not willing to give up the God that they loved. And so what happens is, long story short, Daniel makes a deal with them, and things work out well. And so we find that Daniel and his friends, you know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but Daniel and his friends were able to prosper just by eating what's called pulse, and still grow strong and fared well. And so They didn't have to eat of those things. They didn't have to observe those gods. And we find out that becomes a dilemma later, but that's not the issue for our lesson. All right, in Daniel 1:8, here's what he says about Daniel. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So what we find is Daniel was a man of God, and even at a very young age had decided, listen, I'm not doing that. You can do whatever you want to do, but I'm not doing it. His friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we know the story about them being cast into the fire. You know all of that. They also took the same such type of a stand, but this is a stand that Daniel took. Now, here's a situation. We find this about Daniel in chapter 1, verse 17. God had given him a unique gift, a very special gift. He had the ability to interpret dreams and visions. And in that day, God was revealing himself in such a way. And so in Daniel 1:17, it says, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So all 4 of them had this special ability in learning. They could learn well and quickly, and they could pick up on these things very quickly. They had great wisdom. But Daniel was even a step above that, and God had gifted him with the ability to interpret dreams. Now that's really important, and that plays into all of this, because this is how God uses Daniel to impact literally the entire world and in interpreting these dreams. So Nebuchadnezzar, now keep in mind, Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon. He is in charge. He is the most powerful man in all the world. Now I'm going to share some things about that in a moment, because Nebuchadnezzar actually had the ability to lead Babylon to actually control the entire world. He just chose not to. But God actually gifted him the ability to do that and instructed him that he could if he wanted to. But he chose not to. He chose rather to just pretty much stay within the confines that he had kept and those that he had conquered in that Middle East. And that's an interesting thing, because of all the kingdoms that have ever been, he is the one that had the ability to do the most, but chose to do the least. And it's kind of an interesting thing with him. But he had a vision. And so what he does is, in this vision, he decides, I need my vision interpreted. And so he calls all of his astrologers and his soothsayers and magicians and you name it. And he calls them all together and he says, hey, listen, I had a vision and I need somebody to interpret it. And they're like, fine, that's not a problem. Tell us your vision. He said, well, no, it doesn't work that way. All right, because you could just tell me anything. If I told you my vision, you could say anything. Who am I to know if it's right or wrong? So here's the deal. I want you to also tell me my vision, and in addition to that, interpret it. That way I'll trust your interpretation, because if you know the vision, then I'll trust that you also know the interpretation. They're like, well, how can we know the vision? You're the one that dreamed it, not us. And so nobody could do it. And so it upset him. He's like, I don't have anybody in my kingdom that can do this. And so his goal was, he thought, well, I'll just kill them all if that's the best they can do. And Daniel said, whoa, don't we all get an option on this? You know, Daniel said, wait. He's acting kind of hastily here. Let me have a shot at this. All right? And so he calls Daniel in. And when he calls Daniel in, we find that in Daniel 2:2, he says, and then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. So that's where he calls them all in, and then they couldn't do it. And so Daniel then, he steps up and says, I can do this. And we find, and that's what we're going to pick up on, is what Daniel says about his dream and about his vision. And we see in chapter 2, verses 31 all the way to 45, we see where Daniel reveals his vision. And then in addition to revealing his vision, he also gives him the interpretation of this vision. Now, just to make it simple, you can read that while I'm talking if you like, and you'll get a grip on what it's all about. But basically what happens is this. he tells him he saw a statue. He says, you saw a statue. The head of the statue is made out of gold. And he says, the breast and the arms are made out of silver. And the belly and the thighs are made out of brass. And the feet are part iron and part clay. And he tells them that then a stone comes out of like nowhere, all right? This stone comes out and smashes the feet so that it can't hold them up, and the entire statue just crumbles down, and the stone grows into a mountain. He says, that's the vision. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar's like, whew, yeah, I can't believe it. That's the vision. I can't believe it. Yeah, that's the vision. All right, good. He says, now let me tell you the interpretation. And so this is where we're at with Daniel. He says, this is the vision. And then he begins to give the interpretation. Before we get into this vision, though, I want to establish a few things. I want to first establish the purpose in the vision. Keep in mind, and this is really important for us even today, because we don't think that the history of all of this is so important as to how it relates to the future, but it does. When we look back at this vision, what we find is ever since the time of Abraham, we see that God is dealing directly with the Jews. I mean, he is building a nation. All of his prophets are coming out of the Jewish empire, the kingdom, and they go through a time where they have judges that rule them. They go through a time where they have kings that rule them, and a time where Israel and Judah is united as one whole kingdom, and David reigns, and then Solomon reigns, and then Rehoboam and Jeroboam fight for control, and they divide, the kingdom divides, and we find Judah and Benjamin become what's called the southern kingdom, and the other 10 tribes become by different names, but basically they are Israel, the northern kingdom. And that northern kingdom of Israel never have a godly king in their entire lineage. They have kings, but they are not godly kings. They are not kings that are after the lineage of David. They are just random kings. If a guy had the ability and the power to overthrow another king, he could do so and become king. And so that was Israel's lot. Judah, however, had a mixture of evil kings and good kings. But the one thing Judah did have was all of their kings were of the lineage of David. And so that lineage that God had promised to David, that someone would always be on the throne of his lineage, played out just the way God said it would play out. And so what we find is that here, when we're looking at all of this picture, we're looking at a time where God has dealt with this kingdom of Israel and then dealt with the Judah all the way up until this point, and until the point where Babylon takes them captive. And that begins when Babylon takes them captive. We find the very last king of Judah, and we do not see another king for Judah from there till now. All right? And we will not see another king that's of the throne of David until Jesus Christ himself comes and reigns. Now, that being the case, what we call that is the time of the Gentiles. It's a time where God stopped allowing Israel, or allowing them to have absolute and total control of their nation. The promise that he made to Abraham is kind of stalled out at this point. All right, when we're talking about the Palestinian covenant where he promised them all that land and promised them that, it stalls out right here at this place where Babylon takes them captive. From this moment on, they don't have control of their own nation, and they are always threatened by other nations. Give you an example. You bring that, tell me a time where Israel had complete and total control from this moment all the way up until 1948. None. Technically, not until 1967, because they still weren't admitted in as a nation. So what we find is that all the way up until that point, they were not even in control of their own nation. They were always subject to another nation in their control. Even now, when you think about it, though they do, and though they have their own government, though they do possess their own land, they are constantly under threats from other lands. We're right in the heart of it. We see what's going on now with the Hamas. We know what's going on over there. And they're always under threat by all of those folks that believe the Palestinians should be the ones that are there. Palestinians should have Jerusalem. They ought to have the West Bank. They ought to have Gaza. All of that should be ruled and reigned by the Palestinians. And so we have the Hamas that is attacking them. They say that this attack is the worst one they've experienced since they've become a nation. And so what we find is this is a huge, huge event. But they have always, and even today, while they have their own government, they are still under a constant threat by other nations. They're not secure by any stretch of the imagination. Now, I say that because when, for example, when David was king, when Solomon was king, and when most of the other guys were kings, even though there were a lot of different people around them, they were really not threatened. They had powerful armies. They had strong forces. They had control of their nations. It wasn't until Babylon took them into captivity, that they really moved into a position where they no longer had any rule, any reign, and they were under continual threat. Even in times where they were able to move back to their own land and live there, they lived under the rule of someone else. If you remember, even when Nehemiah brings them back and builds the walls, they're still, all that they did was by permission of the king of Persia. All right, so they still was under the rule and under the threat, if you would, of anyone else that if they chose to rebel, they would be killed or they would be taken over. And so this is what they had. Have you ever thought about what makes Israel so valuable? What makes that land so valuable? Why is it that everybody wants Israel? It's not a big oil field. I mean, I could understand if somebody wanted, I don't know, Kuwait or somebody that has some oil that really is kind of a prominent in that respect, or somebody else that has some other type of big industry or whatever. But Israel, really, the only thing that's good about Israel in that regard is where it's located. All right, it's a good trade route. At that time, more so than today. Today, it's not so relevant because we have, air traffic and all that kind of thing, and so it's not such a big deal. But in their day, if you wanted to get from, say, Babylon down to Ethiopia or Egypt, the only way to get there is really that made any sense at all was to come right through Israel. And so that's what made Solomon so rich. He was in a location where everybody had to trade with him. That's how he wound up with all these concubines and everything else. So everybody that's going from north to south or south to north, they're going to go right through the heart of Israel. They have no choice. Everybody that comes in off of the river, everybody comes in off the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, everybody that comes in off of that, you come in on Israel's banks. And you've got to bring your load in there, and then wherever you take it from there is your business, whether it's up to Lebanon, whether it's down to Egypt, whether it's over to Babylon, wherever it might be. Again, everybody coming in, they've got to deal with Israel. If you're on the east side, if you're in Asia, and you want to come over and get to the Mediterranean Sea so that you can trade, the only choices you had is you could travel south and go down through the Persian Gulf, or you could come across Jordan River and go out and cross the Mediterranean Sea. But again, you got to deal with Israel, all right? And so they're strategically located, in that day, very strategically located. So everybody kind of wanted control of that. If you were going to control the Middle East, you really needed to control Israel. So from that moment on, it's considered and called the time of the Gentiles. Now you need to kind of place that in your mind, because that plays an important part. Because the time of the Gentiles, when the time of the Gentile ends, is when Christ returns. That's an important thing to know. All right? So know that we are living in the time of the Gentiles. The time of the Gentiles started with Babylon conquering Judah, and it continues until Christ comes and returns and sets up his kingdom and rules and reigns. All right? So keep in mind that it's important for us to know that. Now, we will be raptured out. And when we are raptured out, there'll still be 7 years of the time of the Gentiles, but it will also be that 70th week of Daniel's prophecy. And so what happens is that it's a time for Israel to be punished so that they could then, it's the end of all of that. And it brings it to that climax so that now they're done. The only ones that are left are saved Israel, and they can move into the promised land. All right? And so that's the situation. So it's the time of the Gentiles all the way up until that point. So it's important for you to kind of let that stick in your head. Let me give you a New Testament verse for that. Luke 21:24. This is Jesus speaking. And he speaks here and he says, "And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled." So Israel is going to be beaten down from the moment Babylon takes them into captivity until the moment that Jesus Christ returns and sets up his kingdom. All right? And we do see that, do we not? I mean, even in our time frame, in our era, you have the Holocaust, which, millions of Jews died in that. They have always been downtrodden in that regard. They've always been beaten and always been persecuted. Jesus said it himself. We have other times in history where the same thing has taken place, even back in the, I guess we would call the Dark Ages, when all the battles were going on, whether or not, it was a fight between the Muslims, basically, in England as to who was going to control the land. And Israel kind of caught in the mix of it. They're trying to live there, but at the same time, they have no control over it. And so we see all of these kinds of things that's taken place all the way through the course of time. It's a time of the Gentiles. And in the time of the Gentiles, like it or not, Israel's going to take a beating. Now, you don't have to agree with Israel. You don't have to look at Israel and say, listen, they're good, godly people. They're not, all right, as a nation. In fact, they're wicked people. They're out of God's will. They're not where God can use them or do for them. They're in a time, like it or not, they're in a time where they're actually suffering because of their rebellion, and they have continued to rebel even in the midst of it. All right, so don't feel sorry for them, but understand that listen, God still has a plan for Israel, and the promises that he gave to Abraham regarding Israel still hold. So regardless of the kind of people they are, regardless of what they do or what they've done, keep in mind we have an obligation not to curse them but to bless them. That's the plan. And so, just so you know, all right? And so, with all of that having been said, let's take a look at some of this statue. All right, Daniel chapter 2, verse 37, he talks about the head of gold. All right, this statue, just so you know, is a picture of kingdoms. All right, to give you a real quick idea, and we'll talk about them when we get there. But the first real nation that controls the world, or controls that part of the world, and keep in mind, all we're concerned about is Israel. That doesn't mean that Babylon at this point is controlling China. All right? It doesn't mean that he's actually controlling Europe at this time. He's not. He has chosen to only control that Middle East all the way down and possibly even into Egypt. All right? And Egypt's debatable. And so we have all of that. All right. Now, there was a time where other nations rose. Egypt was a world power at one time, but that was a different picture. We're talking about a time now where it's in the time of the Gentiles, where the nation Israel is now going to be subjected to whatever the Gentiles choose for them. And so they're under their rule. And so Babylon is that first kingdom. They take them under control. You'll find out that Babylon is defeated then by two countries actually that have merged and come upon Babylon, because Babylon's a very mighty, very strong, very, just very well-to-do nation. And so the Medes and the Persians join forces and come against Babylon and defeat them, and the Medes and the Persians take rule. All right? The Medes and the Persians are later conquered by Greece under Alexander the Great. Greece is later conquered by Rome. All right, and then Rome takes us up into the New Testament. Now, we'll talk beyond that when we get that far. But right now, this statue basically depicts these four kingdoms. And so what Daniel is saying, listen, there's going to be four kingdoms that are going to rule. All right. When we get down to the fourth one, we're going to find out that there is another segment to that where that one is revived. That fourth one actually dies out and then is revived. And then Jesus returns and conquers that and rules for eternity. But he's saying that up until that time, this statue reflects those ruling kingdoms during what's called the time of the Gentiles. All right. The head is a head of gold. Daniel 2:37 says, "Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power and strength and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold." So he says, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold. All right, that statue that you see, that gold head is you. And so we look at that and we realize that he's letting him know that, listen, you are the dominant kingdom. You are the kingdom of the day. All right, there's no one as powerful as you. You are the head of gold. Now, there is a vision that Daniel actually sees over in Daniel chapter 7. It's a different vision altogether, but the content is the same. Daniel doesn't see a statue, but he actually sees 4 beasts that rise up out of the sea. Each of these beasts, he tells us, represents a kingdom. The first beast that rises up out of there is also, and he says clearly, this is Babylon. This is Nebuchadnezzar. All right, Daniel chapter 7 and verse 4 says the first was like a lion, had eagle's wings, and he says, "I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it." We're told that these great beasts are kingdoms. He says in verse 17 of that same chapter, "These great beasts which are four kings which shall arise out of the earth." So he tells us these are kingdoms. All right. And he says the vision in Daniel chapter 7 ultimately is going to give us greater details about these kingdoms when we get into them. All right. But let's take a first look at the kingdom that starts this whole thing, and is Babylon. Now, the interpretation that we find in chapter 2 in verse 37 says, "Our king are a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given unto thee a kingdom, power and strength and glory. Wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field, the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand." So he's saying God has given you the entire world, whether it be mankind, whether it be animal kingdom, it all belongs to you. You have control. God has given it to you, and hath made thee ruler over them all. If you choose, you can rule the entire world. All right, God's given it to you. Thou art this head of gold. He's saying God has made you the ruler of this world. You have at your hands, you've got it all. All you got to do is take it. He chose to just do the Middle East, but God let him know that, listen, I've given you all of it. You could take charge of the entire world should you choose to do so, all right, because I've given it to you. Now, the interesting thing about that is keep in mind that we're focusing on the area around Judah. That's always our focus. And though Babylon's not this far-reaching power as other nations are going to become, they are incredibly dominating. In Daniel's vision, he sees them as a lion. That's that power. He's saying you're a king of kings. You are, everybody will answer to you if you just rise up. And he's saying, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the most powerful. And then he describes them as a lion with wings. Now, interesting enough, the gate of their city to go into Babylon is a lion with wings. And it's kind of an interesting thing. But the wings donate the fact, give credibility to the fact that they are able to come in quickly and swiftly and undetected. Just all of a sudden they're there. And it's the idea that how fast Nebuchadnezzar caused Babylon to rise to power. Because, it was fast. It's this deal. God did not give all of this power to Babylon. What he gave was the power to Nebuchadnezzar. When you look at this vision that Daniel saw in chapter 7, he said it was a lion with wings, and he said it had legs of a man and the heart of a man. So what we find is he's saying, listen, this nation is strong and powerful because God has made the man, Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of this nation, strong and powerful. It is Nebuchadnezzar that God has chosen to use. I mean, how many times do you see in Scripture where he uses a pagan king to have a vision that impacts the world? You know, he chose Nebuchadnezzar, a man that was a pagan, wanted people to worship him. He used Daniel, obviously, to interpret it, but he gave the vision to Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't give it to Daniel. He gave it to Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. And so when we see this, it's kind of an interesting thing, but God has chosen to use him in that way. By the way, there are several kings in history that we see God has chosen to use in that way. Cyrus is one of them. Darius is another one. So we see some of those where God uses in just that way. All right? And one last thought before I close out tonight is Babylon, as I said, was the smallest of all the empires. However, when we look at this, what we find is that God had chosen Nebuchadnezzar in such a fashion that he could have done most anything. But God allowed him at one point to actually lose his mind. He decides he gets power hungry. And God causes him to lose his mind. He goes out and he actually, for a length of time, he's out there grazing with the animals, eating grass. He loses his mind. And then when he comes back, when God regains his senses, gives him back his senses, we find that he actually seems to make a decision to trust God and to lean upon him, and he made him his God. It's an incredible thing. In Daniel 4:34, he says this, "And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation." So Nebuchadnezzar realizes who he is and realizes what has taken place. I'm going to run you over for just a minute because I do want to get this last statement in. The end of Babylon comes when the son of Nebuchadnezzar, his son Belshazzar, rules. And he's wicked, and he is not a man chosen by God. He's not someone that God's going to use. Like I said, Babylon was great because of Nebuchadnezzar, not because of Babylon. So Belshazzar comes into a great nation, but he just lays it to waste because he is not the leader. And so what we find is he really abuses all the things that had belonged to God, the vessels of God, and parties with them, and instead of honoring and recognizing them. And so God uses a unique and mysterious thing where the hand of God writes on the wall. You guys familiar with that? It says in Daniel 5:5, "In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall, the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote." So you see a part of God's hand that's writing. And then Daniel 5:25 says, "And this is the writing that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin." And then he gives the interpretation in Daniel 5:26. And in that interpretation, he basically tells them, this night, you're going to die. This night. And he did. That very night, the Medes and the Persians came upon Babylon and conquered Babylon and overthrew Babylon and became a ruling power. And that's how Babylon's power was laid to waste. All right? Partly because what had happened was they just were done. God was done with them. They had taken it too far. All right? And so that's the head. That's the head of gold that we find in regard to this vision. All right? It's the end that you're going to enjoy, because that's when we get into all the things that I know you like to get into. But you got to get all of this to get there. It's important to understand that it begins here with the time of the Gentiles. All right? Any questions about that? All right. I hope you're going to enjoy this okay. I hope I didn't bore you with it. A lot of it's going to be like that until we get to what you really enjoy. So I hope you're okay with that. All right, so we'll deal with that. All right, next week we'll deal with the Mede and Persians. All right. Dear Father, Lord, thank you for the time you've given us. We ask, Lord, that you'll use it in such a way that it causes us to grow in your word, that we'll know more and understand more of why you've chosen to act and to work in such a fashion as you have. And Lord, I just pray that we'll just have a desire to do more and want to do more for what you want us to do. Lord, that we might serve you all the better. In Jesus' name, amen.